Hey there, Randy Walker, WorldTennisMagazine.com. You can follow me on Twitter /X at Tennis Publisher, and want to talk about the career Grand Slam. So Carlos Alcaraz became the ninth man to win the career Grand Slam, winning all four major championships in a career. And he won it by completing his fourth leg at the 2026 Australian Open. Dramatic win over Alexander Zverev in the semifinals, fighting off cramps, injury. Zverev served for the match in the fifth set, and then outslugged Novak Djokovic in a four-set final, 7-5 in the fourth, completing the career Grand Slam and winning his seventh major title. But I want to talk about the career Grand Slam. He was the ninth man to win the career Grand Slam. He's the youngest of the nine to complete a career Grand Slam. Who was the first player to win a career Grand Slam? That is a great trivia question, and I'm going to give you the answer right now. It was Fred Perry, the great British player. He completed the first career Grand Slam in 1935 when he won the French championships, but it wasn't a career Grand Slam at the time because the term Grand Slam was not really in the tennis vernacular at the time. So it wasn't the career Grand Slam at the time because nobody was talking about the career Grand Slam at the time. They were barely even talking about the Grand Slam period. So first, let's go through the list of all the players who have completed a career Grand Slam in men's singles. And then we'll talk to you about the Fred Perry story. But obviously, Fred was first, 1935. 1938, of course, Don Budge won the first Grand Slam period, which is all four majors in the same year. A career Grand Slam, it's actually just the Grand Slam. But the previous year, he had won Wimbledon and the U.S. Open, and Wimbledon and the U.S. Championships. And then in 1938, he won the Australian, and he won the 1938 French Championships. And that completed his career Grand Slam, technically, even though it was not referred to as that. But Don Budge talks about it in his writings and his autobiography that he was going to go for it. He was going to go for winning the four big tournaments, to sweep them all. So Rod Laver was the next to complete a career Grand Slam, the next man to complete a career Grand Slam. And he actually won the career Grand Slam in the same tournament where he won the Grand Slam, which was the 1962 U.S. Championships, where he won all four in the same year. But he had never previously won the U.S. Championships, and by winning in 1962, it completed his career Grand Slam and his actual Grand Slam. Of course, Laver, the Rocket, he turned the trick again in 1969, winning another calendar year Grand Slam, another Grand Slam in 1969 in the pro era. But in between then, Roy Emerson won all four major titles in his career, and he completed that in 1964 Wimbledon was when he finished his career Grand Slam. The next player to turn the trick was Andre Agassi, 1999 French Open final. Came back from 2-0 to beat Andrei Medvedev of Ukraine in the final. And then the next player to do it was Roger Federer, 2009 French Open. Finally got that French Open victory when Rafael Nadal lost to Robin Soderling in the fourth round, and Federer beat Soderling in the final to complete his career Grand Slam. It was only French title. Then the next year, Nadal won it at 2010 U.S. Open. That completed his career Grand Slam. And then Novak Djokovic, he won his career Grand Slam in the 2016 French Open final. And then, of course, Carlos Alcaraz at the 2026 Australian Open. But let's turn our clock back to the 1930s, we'll say. So the term Grand Slam, where does it come from? Where did it come from? It's from bridge. I don't play bridge, so I don't really know what, when you turn all your tricks in a bridge hand, I guess. It's a Grand Slam. So I don't know. Play bridge, so I don't know that, but that's evidently where it came from. And the first time that it was used actually was in golf, and it was Bobby Jones, the famous Georgia golfer, and he won the golf Grand Slam in 1930. And in that era, the Grand Slam of golf was the U.S. Open, the Open Championship, or otherwise known as the British Open, the U.S. Amateur, and the British Amateur. There were two amateur titles that were included in the Grand Slam in golf in that era. And there was a writer for the Atlanta Journal named O.B. Keller. And O.B. Keller used the term Grand Slam when Jones won the U.S. Open at Marion Cricket Club to complete the Grand Slam. And, he used the term, that it's, kind of like a Grand Slam, in bridge. So that's where it was first used in the vernacular of golf. But it wasn't until 3 years later that it was used in tennis. So there was an Australian player named Jack Crawford who won in 1933. He won the Australian Championships, he won the French Championships, and he won Wimbledon. And in those days, it was the amateur years. The federations had total control over the players. And Jack Crawford wanted to go home to Australia. He was exhausted. But the Australian Federation made him play the U.S. Championships because the U.S. Lawn Tennis Association, the modern-day USTA, paid a guarantee of money to the Australian Federation to get Jack Crawford to play the U.S. Championships because it would be a draw and it'd be a great story, going for all the big titles, etc. So Jack Crawford played the 1933 U.S. Championships, got to the final where he played ... Fred Perry in the final. And Jack Crawford led 2-1. So he was one set from being the first ever player to sweep all the big titles in tennis. But he got tired. Everything was a hot day. Didn't really know how to perk himself up from his exhaustion and so forth. And in those days, players drank brandy to try to make them feel better. So Jack Crawford was sipping brandy on changeovers to try to get him, rejuvenated against Fred Perry. But, I guess that all that did was get him drunk, So I don't know if it was the exhaustion or the booze, but Fred Perry won those last 2 sets from Jack Crawford, losing only one game. And that's where Fred Perry won his first ever major title. But leading into that U.S. Championships, a writer from the New York Times named John Kiernan, in previewing the U.S. Championships, talked about Jack Crawford and that he could be could complete a sort of Grand Slam. So he first used the term, and then Allison Danzig, also from the New York Times, in writing about the final, said that Crawford was attempting to complete what would be something like a Grand Slam. So those were the first two big time media mentions in tennis of the term Grand Slam. And Bud Collins, the incomparable Bud Collins, in his book, The Bud Collins History of Tennis, his encyclopedia, he talks about the origins of, the terminology, and talks about that famous Crawford-Perry match from the 1933 U.S. Championships, etc. So, but Bud actually also talks about there was a reporter for the Reading Eagle newspaper in Pennsylvania named Alan Gould. And Alan Gould also, way before, or not way before, but weeks before the New York Times article, he used the term that Crawford would potentially going for a Grand Slam, a sort of Grand Slam term in his article. So Bud Collins credits Gould for first term using the term in tennis, and it was used again in golf in 1960 when Arnold Palmer had won the Masters and the U.S. Open to start the 1960 golf major season, and he and the Pittsburgh golf writer Bob Drum were talking about how he would be going for the third leg of his Grand Slam at the Open Championship, which he didn't get. And at that point in golf, the Grand Slam were the four majors were now the Pro Grand Slam, which was the Masters, the U.S. Open, the Open Championship, and the PGA, which it is now. But Don Budge, in his autobiography, he talks about how when he won the Grand Slam all in the same calendar year in 1938, the first person to do it, that nobody really mentioned the word Grand Slam. Nobody mentioned. They just said, a sweep of the major titles, etc. And the next player to win a Grand Slam was Maureen Connolly in 1953. And she mentions that nobody mentioned the word, the term Grand Slam, and you look in the in all the articles and so forth, that it's not mentioned. But I think there was an article when she won the U.S. championships to win the Grand Slam, that said that she swept all the major titles in the world except the Italian championships. So the terminology Grand Slam was not used there. I have a video on this YouTube channel. You can Google it or search for it on YouTube, where I talk about the history of the terminology Grand Slam, etc., and how it wasn't part of the vernacular. And then when Rod Laver won the Grand Slam in 1962, it was then used as that terminology. It was used as a Grand Slam. And again, of course, in 1969, when Laver won his second Grand Slam. And you can read about that in his book with Bud Collins, The Education of a Tennis Player, which I also published, and I don't seem to have it here within grasp. But yeah, so that was, so the term Grand Slam was not really, in the vernacular. And it's also important to point out that, people say like, Carlos Alcaraz won his seventh Grand Slam title. He didn't win his seventh Grand Slam title. He won his seventh major title. Grand Slam is just all four of the majors encapsulated in one calendar year. Each individual tournament in a Grand Slam is a major. So Carlos Alcaraz has won 7 major championships, not 7 Grand Slams. So that's also very important. And that was a big stickler with Bud Collins, and it's a stickler with me too. But going back to that 1935 French championships, when Fred Perry became the first player to win the career Grand Slam, even though it wasn't the career Grand Slam at the time, because that's not what it was called. But he won that title. He beat Gottfried von Krom in the final, the great German player Gottfried von Krom, who is famous. Most people these days know Gottfried von Krom from being the opponent to Don Budge in the famous Davis Cup match at 1937 at Wimbledon, where he lost to Don Budge, and it's featured in the book Terrible Splendor. And Gottfried von Krom famously got the telephone call before the match from Adolf Hitler saying, "You have to win for the German fatherland." That was quite the intimidating phone call, to say the least, before the match. I remember Don Budge, when he was asked about that years later about that match, and he was in the locker room when von Krom got that call, and he goes, "Well, why didn't Franklin Roosevelt call me? Didn't he give a damn?" So that was kind of interesting. But I looked up, in the context of the first ever career Grand Slam, I looked up the New York Times from June of 1935 when Fred Perry won that French championship, and just to see what they were referencing as far as, did they mention a career sweep of big titles or anything? No mention of that. It was an Associated Press article, to be fair, in the New York Times that day. But I found it very interesting because there was this one few sentences that caught my attention, which the Associated Press wrote in that article. Observers believe there was a growing tendency among the players to regard the hard court tournament. Clay courts in that era were called hard court tournaments, which I don't understand, but they were referred to as hard court. So among the players regard the hard court tournament as no longer one of first importance since France lost the Davis Cup. So they were already talking about how the French Championships was not one of the big tournaments that year, or was beginning to lose its relevance. And it's important to discuss in that context why the Grand Slam tournaments are the Grand Slam tournaments. The Grand Slam tournaments are the Grand Slam tournaments because those four nations, Australia, the United States, Britain, and France, were the first four nations to win the Davis Cup. And in those years, in that era, the winner of the Davis Cup got a bye to the final, which was called the Challenge Round. And all the other nations competed to have the right to challenge the Davis Cup holders for the Davis Cup title. And those preliminaries, kind of like the semis or the quarters or the semis and the final before the Challenge Round, were usually played in the country where the holders had they had the right to host the Davis Cup final, the Challenge Round, and the rounds leading into the Challenge Round were also played in the country of the holder, and that was also kind of combined with the national championship of that country. So that's why all the best players played in those four big tournaments, because all the best players in the world from all the best countries were there. So that's why those tournaments were the best, and that's why they were considered the majors, and that's why they're considered the Grand Slams. But it was interesting that in 1935, this was the end of the Four Musketeers. Their dominance in Davis Cup had ended. And so people were saying, oh, you know what? Well, the French Championships really isn't, a big important tournament anymore because the Musketeers aren't there, and it's just not a big deal anymore. So that's kind of interesting with that statement that they that the Associated Press wrote that. And then they also wrote, a lack of spirited play was apparent this year. Wow. So the players didn't even give a hoot about the tournament, which, I don't, Fred Perry beating Gottfried von Crom, I mean, that's a legit, major final. Those are two of the greatest players of all time in that era. Anyway, the other thing that was interesting, it says, opinion was that Czechoslovakia loom as a powerful Davis Cup threat. The Australians, who appeared to be likely finalists in the Cup tournament with the Czechs, admitted they feared the Czechs more than the defending champion English. So could the Czechoslovakian Open could have been perceived as a major, just speculation there. That's kind of funny. But yeah, it also goes to show you that, not, the four major tournaments, throughout the years, some years they were, other tournaments were regarded higher than the now Grand Slams. So, in that era, the French Championships maybe was perceived not as important. Certainly, you could argue in the in the 60s and 70s, the French and the Australian Open weren't really as regarded as Wimbledon and the U.S. Open. And in that era, also you had the Italian Championships was regarded more heavily than the Australian Championships per se. Not all the great players played it, etc. The WCT Finals was regarded as a bigger, better tournament, etc. So, not all the Grand Slams carry equal weight, through the years. I mean, many people argue with regard to Margaret Court. She won 24 major titles, but most of them were before the Open era, when the Australian Championships had very weak fields and there were only Australian players and nobody would go out to Australia to play. So many people critique Margaret Court's numbers and saying, oh, well, she didn't, win really full Grand Slams. But, Grand Slam is a Grand Slam. Grand Slam tournament is a Grand Slam tournament, a major tournament is a major tournament. She won 24, etc. So anyway, that's just a little history for you with the completion of this career Grand Slam by Carlos Alcaraz. Again, the ninth man to turn the trick and the youngest at age 22. So we'll see if anybody else can turn that trick. Yannick Sinner can certainly do it at the French Championships this year, where he'd become the 10th man to win the career Grand Slam. So anyway, just a little history here from Randy Walker with the assistance, of course, of the late, great Bud Collins and the Bud Collins History of Tennis. I've been privileged to be his publisher, his last publisher, and published the last 3 editions of his Bud Collins Encyclopedia of Tennis, and also his book Rod Laver, the Education of a Tennis Player. And Bud was certainly a major mentor to me, major role model for me, and he was a friend of so many. So many people around the world felt like Bud Collins was their best friend or one of their best friends. And, that's just a testament to Bud. So anyway, but don't drink any brandy like Jack Crawford did when he was hobbled and dealing with the heat of the U.S. Championships final. That was quite a funny instance there. And would be remiss if I didn't talk about my late great pal Sidney Wood, who won Wimbledon in 1931 without playing the final. And you can read about that in the Wimbledon final that never was, the book here. And he played a French Open mixed doubles final, hammered on brandy, playing with Helen Wills. And you can read that crazy tale in his book, The Wimbledon Final That Never Was. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that, especially since it's right over my shoulder. So anyway, please subscribe to this channel. I will be posting some interesting anecdotes and fun stories and thoughts a little more often here on YouTube. And follow me on Twitter/X at Tennis Publisher. You can follow me on Instagram too at Tennis Publisher. I had a little more personal stuff on there, not so much on the tennis stuff. But WorldTennisMagazine.com on Instagram, and also follow us on WorldTennisMagazine.com. So and buy my tennis books at NewChapterMedia.com. So anyway, Randy Walker, over and out from Vero Beach, Florida.